Okay, so overexploitation. We're going to talk a little bit about food again and about medicine. The three pictures there are fiddlehead ferns, which are delicious, by the way, ginseng, wild ginseng from Appalachia or Alabama. I actually don't remember where this came from, this particular picture. And then those are garlic scapes, which are unbelievably delicious. And because those two I mentioned as being delicious are so delicious, they're very popular to be foraged as food sources for human beings. Now, unfortunately, like with some types of mushrooms, these are very valuable to restaurants. And so what ends up happening is huge numbers of fiddlehead ferns in Northern California, for example, and the Pacific Northwest are harvested by amateur, but often by professional foragers, and they're sold in bulk to restaurants or to other various venues at farmers markets, etc. And what happens is with a fiddlehead fern is, as you see it there, that's not a fully developed plant. There are no sori have been developed, no spores. So essentially harvesting the plant prior to it disseminating its genetic material out there and spreading. Okay, so this can and has resulted in pretty serious overexploitation and some loss in this particular plant species. And so to the right there, you see that those are garlic scapes, and they are so good. And they seem to grow everywhere at certain times of year. But there are places that people have noticed where there used to be garlic scapes where there are none because people have so thoroughly harvested these plants. And again, we've talked about why losing biodiversity is so bad. So I'm not going to get into why losing this species is bad. Losing any species is bad. Species are bad. So again, this is just another example of overexploitation. And finally, ginseng is a valuable medicinal herb, and it takes a very long time to grow. And wild-caught ginseng is worth a lot of money. I mean, you're talking about the amount of money that would surprise you. And so it's very lucrative for people to go through those hills and to harvest ginseng. Now, one thing that happens with ginseng harvest, these other two plants, not as much, but it's still to a degree. Ginseng harvesting, because people are digging, it can be very destructive, and kind of like how wild pigs can be destructive by digging up and destroying the kind of fragile soil ecosystem and the understory ecosystems that some of these plants exist in. These people tromping through the woods and digging up things are inevitably disrupting these ecosystems, and it's just another side bit of destruction associated with overexploitation of plant species. Okay, agricultural runoff largely affects, or at least in what it's sort of depicted to affect, is water systems. Now, even in the picture on the left, you can see the little dots representing nutrients being applied, whether it's being applied via pellets in the soil, that is, as water goes, it's leached down through the soil into the water table, or as it runs off the top as it's applied in a spray, a foliar spray, or if it's dropped in by the literal ton from an airplane, and then it mixes with water during rain or in a watering event. That will run off the field, which is generally sloped on purpose so that there is runoff, so water does not sit on the field and rot the plants. And that agricultural runoff has with it a large number of nutrients. Or another source of agricultural runoff is from huge piles of chicken litter from the chicken industry. And these are heavy in phosphorus and nitrogen, and they'll run off into wetland systems or whatever the nearest water is, rivers to lakes to the sea. And you'll see there an algal bloom on the right. and that's because of the high concentration of nutrients that allow those algae to thrive. And that can choke out sea life, that can choke out sea plants because they don't get sun for photosynthesis. There's a lot of problems associated with algae. Algae also can, some varieties of algae produce a toxin as a byproduct of their respiration, and that can kill plant and animal life. Also, the soil in some of these wetlands, and I talked about how having a healthy soil system allows the root systems and the plants and the complex soil structure to hold on to nutrients. Well, they do that, and nutrients accumulate in these wetlands, and it can be detrimental, and it can actually be toxic to species of plants. And unfortunately, tying into some of our other species, that toxicity can be a great environment for some hardy invasive species that will then take over in those fragile and in a way damaged environments because of this agricultural runoff. Okay, as I mentioned already, climate change honestly is a whole class worth, a whole lecture worth, and certainly more than a whole slide worth. But I did want to point to this possible changes infographic of species richness, and we can notice some things that those red areas are species decreasing and a change, and the green areas are an increase of biodiversity. Now, we've talked about we meaning the world is talking about a 2C versus a 4C. How many degrees is the global temperature going to rise? It's not if, but when. It's not if it will, but how many. And something to notice is that with a small increase, there are areas that have some loss, and there are some areas that increase, and it doesn't seem quite as drastic. But something pretty interesting is if you look at that 4 degrees C temperature increase, something to note, look at Southeast Asia, look at the Amazon in Brazil, look at the jungles in West Africa. I mean, look at the United States, we're looking at huge changes and huge loss of life. The tropical jungles in Mexico, the islands in the Caribbean, those are all places that, because of those increased temperatures, those fragile ecosystems, notice those are areas of the world where people go for ecotourism, like we talked earlier. They're having huge numbers of species go extinct, or at least leave those regions. The species richness, the diversity we're talking about, is going to go down. And something to look at, there are some dark green areas where there's a 150 increase in plant biodiversity. Notice where those are. Those are typically cold areas where right now there's not a lot of plant diversity. And so that's something to consider too, is yes, there will be a marginal increase in some of these cooler areas as the temperatures increase and there's more space for some of these more cold intolerant species to move in, but these areas of the world that are rich and biodiverse are going to lose huge amounts of plant diversity. And so conservation and climate change go hand in hand, because no matter what we do, if we can't get a handle on the changing climate, then these areas where we have ecotourism, these areas where we find these medicines because there are so many diverse plants, these areas where we get these benefits from, now not the only areas, but we get large benefits from these areas, as well as the oxygen on the planet from the forest, everything like that. Those areas, their plant species richness is going to decrease with climate change. All right, I tried to pick pictures for this deforestation and habitat loss slide that were depressing, but not too depressing. Like there's some, if you Google Amazon deforestation satellite images, or Java, the island of Java deforestation, it would make you pretty sad. So yeah, moving on. to your right, we see deforestation. Now, this could be for a variety of reasons. This is in the Amazon, and this could be for agriculture. They could be logging this. They could be clear cutting this to plant crops. Now, can we blame people? As our population increases, we need more food. We need land for that, and so people are moving out in there. Now, there are other places that could do it, but this is where the people live, and also often this land is remote, and there's a lot of reasons we won't get into, but that's one of the reasons. Other reasons people cut it down is for timber. Wood is valuable, and it's worth a lot of money, and a lot of those timber operations are required to replant. So in these grid areas that you can see here, they'll replant, and that is a huge benefit. However, oftentimes these roads remain, and those roads turn into barriers for animal species. Not so much for plant species usually, but they become barriers for plant species, or excuse me, for animal species crossing those roads that are being traveled by automobiles, and even just them seeing the dirt and not feeling comfortable to cross that. On the left, this is in Southeast Asia for rubber, and you can see that agriculture has spread here, those organized plots, but also there's city growth, and so deforestation happens as we as human beings expand into the forest and into these areas where there haven't been people before. And if we don't do this with thought, with care, with consideration for plant conservation, then we're going to lose species, we're going to lose diversity and richness. I mean, look at the Amazon, look at Indonesia, some of these places where whether it's agriculture, sometimes they'll do slash and burn agriculture where they'll cut everything down and they'll burn it, and that will temporarily provide some richness in the soil where they'll be able to farm it, and then because of low quality techniques, they will deplete that soil and they'll have to move on to another plot. And these are people trying to grow food to feed themselves or to make enough money to feed themselves. So, there's a lot to weigh with ethics, and I don't have, and I'm not certainly going to present the solutions to you, but I want you to understand that deforestation and habitat loss are a huge threat to plant conservation and to biodiversity, because as we encroach and as we expand, then diversity suffers. Now, we are the main reason, but we're not the only reason. Climate change influences this. And there are other reasons for deforestation and habitat loss, but I want to focus on the ones that we do and that we can control. All right, these are some invasive species that inhibit plant conservation. Now, I think the picture on the left is pretty, right? And who doesn't like a deep green environment? However, if you look closely, there's nothing really but that plant, and that's kudzu, a plant from Japan that has become invasive all over the South and is a real problem because it does this. It completely covers and completely destroys and takes over entire sections of the forest or of a swamp or really anywhere. It grows all throughout the South. You can be driving on major highways and freeways, and there will be spots where you look out and the only thing are dead trees holding up huge amounts of kudzu. And I'm not even going to get into why it was brought here or how it got here, but it's here. And we're struggling to defeat it because it takes over in a major way. These three species on this take over. Okay, top right is a cane toad. It's not a plant, it's an animal, but I highly recommend you Google the story behind the cane toad and how destructive it is. Okay, they're incredibly destructive to very fragile ecosystems, and as some of those small mammals and insects are destroyed, that is going to affect plants as pollinators and seed dispersal agents are disrupted. Finally, we're here in Utah. We've got tamarisk, okay? Notice these waterways and these banks out here near Moab are completely covered in this salt cedar or tamarisk. And it's a huge problem. And it's a huge problem because it chokes out all other vegetation and it prevents biodiversity from existing in an area that for the desert was where the biodiversity centered in a lot of these areas, because there was water and animals tracking nutrients up and through. There's a lot of reasons why riverbanks are centers for plant biodiversity. And this tamarisk is a real problem. We'll talk about some of the solutions that they're doing for invasive species, but it's kind of difficult once they establish themselves. It's very hard, and we'll talk about some of the strategies that they're using. Okay, we've talked about the benefits of plant conservation and biodiversity, and we've talked about some of the things that loss can impact, or some of the things that are causing those loss. And now I want to talk about what we as human beings are currently doing and what we can do and improve on to conserve plants. So one way is at your house. You have a space, say you have a space with a garden, and some of you don't. It's a privilege when you do have that space, and I know not all of us have that. But when we do have a garden space, or when there are those that have gardens, it's important for us to, or at least it's beneficial for us to plant local plants that are native to our area that will thrive there for a variety of reasons. One, they assist pollination and attract pollinators to come and to help with our crops and to help with pollinating our natives, as well as it becomes a bank for biodiversity. It creates another location where there are diverse plants with unique genetic material that can be shared with other populations of those same plants by pollinators. So private gardens are surprisingly important. There are private individuals who have taken it upon themselves to conserve and to preserve genetic material and genetic diversity in these plants just in their backyards, and it's incredible. Here at the bottom there's a picture of a greenhouse where they're conducting some university research, and to the right is university students, probably graduate students, but maybe undergrads, studying with a professor. He's the professor because he's just standing there. No, I'm kidding. And they're doing research, and they're studying trees, and they're studying tree diversity in this particular forest. And there is lab research and research that goes on in a greenhouse where they study how to increase germination rates of native seed, or how to propagate those plants from cuttings. And we'll actually talk about horticultural conservation in a minute, and there's some overlap there with university research. But so universities, in about every way you could imagine, are seeking funding from the government and private institutions and public institutions in order to further research how to conserve plant biodiversity, and also in some ways how to propagate and further the spread of these plants, both to, well, private places like we'll talk about, and to public individuals. Okay, as we mentioned, or as I mentioned, horticultural plant conservation is something where they will take seed material or woody plant cuttings and develop propagation protocols for these individual pieces of plant material so that they can be, whether from seed or cutting, like I said, turned into a horticultural product where they will develop the method to produce large quantities of them so that they can be bought by the public, so that they can be disseminated to various conservation organizations, and in general so that there are large numbers of these plants available to be used in a variety of different ways. And so in nature, these plants survive at small rates and produce small amount of seed perhaps, but being propagated in huge numbers by the horticulture industry, the number of plants that are just out there and that are available to be planted or produced is hugely increased. And we're actually going to talk about poaching a little bit. And one of the best strategies to deter poachers from stealing these rare or endangered plants is to take that and to turn it into a horticultural product. And what I mean is, say we've got an endangered plant or an endangered cactus, and we can take that and we can either propagate it or clone it or develop some way that we produce large numbers of these. And suddenly, when you talk about a black market situation, you've got an individual plant that used to be one of 12 or 120 and is now one of 12,000 or 120,000. And that will bring its value down. And we'll talk a little bit more about poaching in a minute. So the next way that conservation is done that I want to talk about is habitat restoration or invasive removal. Generally, these go hand in hand. A lot of times habitats become destroyed because they're overrun by invasives. Now, for example, here in the West, there are some tests being done with this specific tamarisk beetle that preys on this tamarisk or salt cedar plant. And obviously, that's bringing in a cat to deal with a mouse problem, and then you have to deal with a cat afterwards. But you know, there's been a lot of research done with this specific beetle that they die off once the tamarisk is gone, and they're hoping that this can be a way to counter, because often habitat restoration is people in muck boots standing in these wetlands or at these shore banks or wherever they are and digging out and physically, mechanically removing these plants and then planting native species in their place and hoping that those can take hold and become established and then restore the balance as closely as we can emulate it to return that to a natural biodiverse place. If you haven't noticed, once habitat gets restored, or gets destroyed, oftentimes this artificial immediate destruction leads to an imbalance in the plants that come up. And so often when there are invasives that are not native, those can just take over. So this is another way that conservation is being done, is through this habitat restoration and invasive removal. One way that diversity is protected, both as sort of a seed bank and repository for genetic material, and other as a way to raise awareness, is by botanical gardens. This is the Ogden Botanical Gardens and Red Butte Gardens. And there are others close by. USU has some up in Davis County, and these are beautiful places to go and walk that are generally meticulously maintained and usually have some conservation and or restoration aspect to their operation. And that's a lot of times how they will have money to do conservation, is by having this botanical garden that you can go and you can see and you can pay an entrance fee and things like that. These botanical gardens are often at the center of societies that, like I said, are a vehicle for conservation in some of the other ways that we've talked about. And they're a place for people to come and to see plants and say, I would like to have that in my yard. And then that horticultural aspect of conservation comes into play as well. Okay, to talk about something now that I'm passionate about. Remember one of those videos, the one to southern Utah, the guy that was poaching cacti? Those weren't even rare or endangered cacti that he was taking, but they were taking them. And something to recognize that poachers are the #1 threat to cactus worldwide. And I'm focusing on cacti both due to personal interest and because they are sort of an example species of high dollar plants. Okay, so these cacti, there are some from Chile that are very valuable. There's something called Eriocarpus that's found in Texas and Mexico that are valuable. Unfortunately, that endangered Perriette cactus from the very beginning is very popular with collectors, and it is found in one place here in Utah. So cacti are becoming more and more trendy as houseplants over the world, and some of these species are rare and therefore very valuable. And a lot of these cacti are small, and you can put them in your shoe, in your shirt, etc., and conceal them so that law enforcement or just concerned individuals don't see. And now these money from these stolen cacti don't generally go to local economies or individuals, but it's people that have come to those locations to steal, to make money. And I mean, we're talking about specimens that online can bring $500 to $1,000 each, or even $12 to $100 each. And if you can gather hundreds of these specimens, it really can add up to people making a lot of money. Now, some of this is done by local people trying to survive and recognizing that there's money to be made, and that's a whole other discussion. But cacti specifically are an important part of ecotourism, and missing or stolen plants can negatively impact communities that rely on this type of ecotourism. Now, what will lead to a decrease in poaching is not more cacti. It's not anything other than individuals being willing to see that poaching is happening and speak up and stop it. There needs to be enforcement, there needs to be legislation, and there needs to be education of local people as to why not to poach, education on to all of us why not to poach, and education to law enforcement and airport individuals and people who customs individuals so that they can identify and stop this poaching. And again, poaching does lead to a decrease in biodiversity, and we want to conserve plants, and poaching is a huge threat to very endangered plants where the number of specimens are in the hundreds or thousands are being collected and sold online. Not just online, but in this day and age, it's a very popular forum in which to send. So what can we do? Now, we've talked about some things that we can do. We've talked about some things that are being done on a human or governmental level. But what you specifically can do is you can volunteer at local botanical gardens. You can support them. You can give them your patronage. You can go and you can buy a t-shirt. You can go and you can pay to get in. And these botanical gardens, I would probably make sure they were one that was doing conservation, but most of them do. And through your dollars with your wallet, you can directly support conservation efforts. You can take botany classes like you're doing now, so you become more aware, and so you're in a position where you can educate people. And education is so important. It's so critical to this. You know, the next one talks about poachers, and I have this comment of think of ways to end or limit poaching. I've given you some, but a lot of it's just to keep a lookout, you know, and end poaching by the next step, by being involved in what your state and local governments are doing. State and local governments are involved in conservation efforts. They allocate dollars to individual organizations, to state organizations, to county organizations, and city organizations related to landscaping, related to beautification. You can influence what kind of plants are being planted in your park, or the drilling that's happening in the habitats of endangered plants and animals. All of this you can be involved in at your state and local governments. You can be involved in stricter enforcement of poaching laws and harsher or more adequately sentenced punishments for poaching. I think there are people that don't realize the financial gain that people are getting from poaching. So sorry I'm harping on poaching a lot, but I'm not sorry. It's a real problem, and particularly with some of these plant species, that the one I've already talked about, and others here in the state and throughout the country, and throughout Mexico, there are plants that are being poached that have hundreds of specimens total left, and they're still being harvested, you know. But I digress. So that's just about got us wrapped up. We've talked about what we can do, and I think I've got one more slide left. So, to recap, why do we care? What plant conservation is directed to preserving plant biodiversity. And plant biodiversity leads to a healthier planet, to healthier people. Plant biodiversity can influence local economies. Plant biodiversity can influence our diet. It can influence our ability to produce food. Plant biodiversity leads to healthier soil, to healthier water systems. Plant biodiversity and the conservation of these plants is critical to our own health and our own survival, and also to the health and survival of our entire planet. And so that's why we care.